Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
I still remember the exact words she sent me that night, and the way they hit me like something I couldn't shake for days. Christmas will be better without you. I stared at that text over and over, my phone shaking in my hand, trying to figure out if she really meant it or if I was imagining the cruelty behind her tone, but I knew her well enough by then to know she meant every single word. I had spent years watching her get everything handed to her, from extra praise at family gatherings to being the favorite in every decision that mattered, while I quietly struggled and worked my ass off to keep my life together, often covering bills and arrangements that no one even thanked me for. And I realized right then that this wasn't just a text, it was a culmination of everything I had felt invisible about for decades, and I wasn't going to let it slide this time. She had no idea that for the past few years, I had been quietly managing some of the family's finances, keeping track of tuition payments for her kids, helping with medical bills, and making sure the basics were covered when everyone else was too busy or too lazy to notice. And I realized that I held the cards, even if she thought she did. That night, I made the decision that this Christmas was not going to be one where I played the invisible, ignored, overworked sister who quietly made sure everyone else's life was perfect while mine was dismissed. I decided that I was going to show her exactly what it felt like to have someone in control of the things she took for granted, and I would do it with precision, so she could not blame anyone else or argue her way out of the consequences. The first move was subtle, but it set the tone for everything that came after. I went into the tuition accounts and medical arrangements that I had access to because of my role managing the family funds, and I froze her next tuition payment for her oldest child, just long enough to make it clear that things were not going to proceed automatically as they always had. I knew that this would cause her a little panic, but not enough for her to guess what was happening or to know it was me. At the same time, I intercepted a minor medical claim that she had submitted for a routine procedure, delaying the processing and forcing her to start calling insurance companies and billing offices, which she hated doing because she always acted like these things were beneath her. Every time she had a complaint about something small or inconvenient, she had acted like the world owed her a favor, so watching her scramble, even slightly, gave me a sense of relief I had not realized I had been craving for years. It was the way she called me that first morning after noticing a discrepancy that made me smile, even though I pretended nothing had changed. She didn't text immediately, but within a few hours, there were multiple messages, each one dripping with frustration and disbelief, asking if I knew what was going on, demanding explanations she didn't have, and for a moment, I thought about replying, just to see her panic escalate, but I didn't. Instead, I let her stew in her confusion, knowing that the stress of trying to fix something she thought she controlled, while I sat back quietly, was the perfect opening move in what was going to be a long game. I also started noticing the way she behaved around the rest of the family, trying to appear calm and composed, but slipping with every failed attempt to manage the bills or the school arrangements. Her usual confidence cracked ever so slightly every time someone asked her about a payment or a confirmation, and she had to give half-explained excuses that made her look unreliable and overwhelmed. She had always assumed she could lean on me for the heavy lifting without a second thought, and now, without knowing why, she was forced to confront the reality that maybe she hadn't been in control at all. And maybe her whole sense of entitlement was built on a shaky foundation that I could destabilize without anyone even realizing it was happening. I didn't reply to any of her frantic texts that evening. I read them, savored the panic and the growing desperation in her tone, and waited for the next step. I knew she would start trying to dig into everything, checking accounts, calling banks, panicking over timelines, and, while she was distracted by those things, I could quietly plan my next moves. I had been underestimated for years, treated like I was only there to maintain the background and the safety nets that she depended on without ever noticing, and now, for the first time, I had all the leverage in the world. And just when I thought the first move had landed perfectly, I noticed the slight change in the way she phrased her messages. She stopped demanding explanations and started asking questions in a hesitant, almost guilty way, as if she was starting to realize she wasn't in control at all, and that someone else, someone she had overlooked and dismissed for decades, had the power to change everything in her little world. I smiled, closed my phone, and sat back, because I knew that Christmas this year wasn't going to be about presents or decorations. It was going to be about a lesson that she would never forget, and I had just set it in motion. By the end of that first night, the realization that she would have to scramble and beg without knowing exactly why felt satisfying in a way I didn't expect, and I understood clearly that this was only the beginning. There would be more moves, more calculated strikes, more moments where she thought she was untouchable and found out she wasn't, but for now I let her stew in uncertainty and panic, knowing that I had finally taken the first step toward proving that her words didn't define me, her opinion didn't matter, and for the first time, I held the power she had always assumed she owned. Her first panic-fueled messages were the only warning she would ever get, and she didn't even know it. The morning after I froze her first tuition payment and delayed the medical claim, I watched quietly from a distance as my sister began to unravel in ways I had anticipated, but still found quietly thrilling because for the first time in years, she had to face real consequences for the life she had assumed would always run smoothly without effort on her part, and it was fascinating to see the cracks form in her carefully curated image of competence and entitlement. She started the day by logging into the school portal for her oldest child, expecting the usual confirmation of automatic payments, and instead found nothing had gone through, which instantly put her in a state of panic she hadn't experienced since she was a teenager and realized her first credit card bill had arrived late. Her fingers trembled over the keyboard as she double-checked the account numbers, refreshed the pages, and called the financial office repeatedly, each time growing more frustrated when the automated system gave her no answers and the representative explained that the payment simply hadn't arrived, which, of course, it hadn't because I had intercepted it. At the same time, her medical office calls started piling up, one after another, each inquiry regarding a procedure she thought had been taken care of automatically, each explanation from the administrative staff giving her less comfort than the last. And I could hear the slight shaking in her voice through her frantic messages that she began sending not to me, not yet, but to mutual friends and family members, asking for advice, explaining her predicament with a mix of disbelief and shame that she had not considered how dependent she had become on others, particularly me, for the most basic management of her financial obligations, which she had always taken for granted because she assumed I would continue to smooth over any bumps without question or acknowledgement, and now she had to scramble without knowing the true cause of her growing problems, which made every step of her panic entirely self-directed and entirely justified. I found myself feeling a mixture of vindication and disbelief at the years of neglect I had endured finally turning into leverage, because the sense of power was not in humiliation alone. It was in watching her assumptions collapse under their own weight, knowing that she had never considered the possibility that someone she had dismissed repeatedly, someone she thought existed merely to support her comforts, could hold the key to her stability, and that realization would linger in her mind. Like a shadow she couldn't shake, slowly growing as each missed payment and delayed claim compounded into a pattern she could no longer ignore or rationalize away. By late afternoon, she finally started sending me direct messages, each one more desperate than the last, carefully phrased in a way that tried to mask vulnerability but failed entirely, revealing her frustration, disbelief, and fear in equal measure, which I read without a single reply, letting her stew in uncertainty because I had learned long ago that the most effective way to influence someone who had relied on manipulation and entitlement was to remove the safety net they assumed was always there and watch as panic and confusion did most of the work on their behalf, and even when she tried to turn the conversation into an argument, claiming some imagined error or oversight, I knew that every demand, every threat, every attempt to regain control only tightened the web I had been quietly spinning. Her frantic attempts to fix things also began to expose her to the rest of the family, because she had no choice but to call or email them in search of support or guidance, and each interaction revealed the cracks in her composure that she had spent years hiding. The same cracks that had allowed me to quietly observe her reliance on my efforts without ever being acknowledged, and as she explained missed deadlines or delayed reimbursements to relatives, I could almost hear the whisper of doubt growing in their minds about her ability to manage responsibilities on her own, and I had to fight the urge to smile at the effectiveness of a plan that was unfolding exactly as I had imagined. Because the long-term consequences were just beginning to appear, and she had no idea who was orchestrating them. I spent the day keeping myself busy, reading her messages, marking the timing of her panicked attempts to resolve issues, and strategically leaving things unresolved just long enough to escalate her anxiety without making it obvious that I was responsible. Because I understood better than anyone that the key to a satisfying reversal was not to act in anger or impulsively, but to create a chain reaction in which she felt fully in control only to discover she was not, and each delay, each failed attempt to correct a situation she had always assumed was under her command, chipped away at the superiority she had cultivated so carefully, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and, most importantly, dependent on my eventual intervention. By the evening, the pattern was clear, and she had crossed the line from confusion to fear, sending a message that was half apology, half accusation, asking if there was some mistake or oversight she had missed. And in that moment, I understood fully that I had reached the tipping point where the first real cracks had turned into a visible chasm, and the rest of the plan, the more significant moves that would truly shift the balance of power, could proceed with the confidence that she had finally begun to realize that the sister she had dismissed and underestimated for years was no longer someone she could control or ignore, and that revelation alone made every second of restraint and patience worth it. Because her unraveling had only just begun, and I was ready to guide it exactly where I wanted it to go. By the time the third day rolled around, I could see the panic in my sister's messages shifting from frustration to genuine fear. Because what she initially believed was a minor inconvenience had grown into a tangled web of consequences she could neither predict nor control. And the realization that she was no longer the one pulling the strings made every frantic inquiry she sent feel like a confirmation of the years of dismissiveness and entitlement she had shown toward me, because she had never paused to consider that I had been quietly observing, noting, and understanding her patterns long before I decided to act, and now every small disruption I caused was amplified by her inability to trace it back to its source, leaving her scrambling helplessly in a maze of her own making that I had carefully manipulated to perfection. I decided it was time to escalate, not recklessly, but with precision, because the first delays and missed payments had revealed the vulnerabilities I had been looking for. And I knew that the next moves had to strike at the heart of the privileges she had long assumed were guaranteed, privileges that had given her a sense of untouchable superiority and an unearned confidence that she could handle everything without accountability. And by carefully targeting the areas she relied on most, the family medical coverage for her children and her access to tuition funds, I could force her to confront the reality that control was an illusion, and that the sister she had so casually sidelined for decades was the one in the driver's seat. I began by redirecting a crucial medical reimbursement, which I had access to through long-standing arrangements no one else had thought to question. And I made sure the paperwork was delayed just enough to create a crisis that she could not solve with her usual calls or complaints, because the last thing I wanted was for her to regain control too quickly. This had to be drawn out so she could feel the anxiety and helplessness accumulate, and as I watched her attempt to navigate the confusion, sending increasingly desperate messages to both the medical office and to friends and family for advice, I realized that her perception of reality was starting to fracture in a way that was entirely deserved. Because for years she had built a life where consequences existed only for others, never for herself, and now she was forced to operate in a world where oversight and planning mattered, and where the sister she had ignored was the one orchestrating the outcome. At the same time, I arranged for a minor tuition discrepancy to emerge in her account, something small enough that she might convince herself it was an error, but consequential enough to trigger a cascade of worry and frantic phone calls. Because I knew she would take the bait immediately, scrambling to solve the problem, unaware that her panic was being guided, and that every step she took to resolve what she believed was an external issue was actually playing right into the strategy one had been assembling for weeks, a strategy built not on vengeance alone, but on the meticulous demonstration that the power she assumed was hers had always been mine to wield, and that every assumption she made about entitlement and control was now being dismantled piece by piece. Her messages to me had become a mix of pleading, self-justification, and veiled threats, because she could sense, even without proof, that I was involved, but she lacked any way to confirm it. And every attempt she made to engage me only highlighted the imbalance that had been hidden for years, because she had never faced a situation where she could not manipulate outcomes with her usual charm and aggression. And now she was navigating a landscape in which patience, precision, and control, qualities she had consistently underestimated in me, determined who held the real power, and that shift was manifesting in her messages, which grew increasingly frantic, scattered, and revealing of the cracks in her usual armor. By evening, I decided to make the next move even more direct, because I knew that allowing her to recover even slightly would risk diminishing the impact of the lesson. So I leveraged access to a shared financial account to temporarily withhold a small, but significant payment that she had assumed would arrive automatically. And I timed it perfectly so that it would coincide with her already escalating panic over the tuition and medical issues, forcing her to juggle multiple crises without the safety nets she had taken for granted, and watching her scramble, explaining herself to billing offices, insurance agents, and even mutual friends. I realized how deeply satisfying it was to witness the immediate consequence of years of her dismissiveness crystallize into tangible anxiety, because for the first time she could not manipulate, charm, or demand her way out of the problem. And her reliance on me had turned into a vulnerability she could not mitigate or ignore. The culmination of that day left her completely destabilized, teetering between disbelief, fear, and frustration, and when I read the final message she sent me before bed, the one that was almost apologetic but carried a sharp edge of disbelief and anger, I knew the stage was set for the ultimate revelation, because she had begun to realize, on a level she had never encountered before, that the sister she had scorned and dismissed had quietly become the arbiter of her stability, and that realization, combined with the mounting chaos, was about to lead her into the next phase of reckoning, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about control, power, and the consequences of underestimating the people she assumed were beneath her notice. By the time the fourth day came around, my sister was operating in a state of constant stress that I had carefully engineered. Because the small disruptions I had set in motion were no longer isolated incidents, but rather a web of interlocking problems that she could neither fully understand nor control, and each new message she sent revealed more of her unraveling confidence. Her reliance on the assumption that someone else would always step in to fix the chaos she refused to see coming, and, as I read her desperate inquiries, I realized that the most effective part of my plan was not the financial obstacles themselves, but the way they forced her to confront the reality that the stability she had always assumed was hers to command was now being held entirely at my discretion. And there was no turning back. I knew that the next move had to hit her where it hurt the most, and for my sister, that was the delicate balance she maintained between appearing confident in front of our extended family and keeping her children's needs met without ever admitting vulnerability. Because she had spent years projecting control and superiority while secretly relying on the infrastructure I and others had quietly provided, and now that infrastructure was slowly slipping away, piece by piece, and I had no intention of letting her rebuild it easily or without consequence, because the lesson she needed to learn required full visibility into her own dependence and the consequences of dismissing me for so long. And that realization was as satisfying as it was necessary. I began by intercepting another series of routine payments, timing them to coincide with the deadlines for her children's extracurricular activities, knowing that the disruption would force her to communicate with multiple organizations at once, creating confusion and frustration, and as the day wore on, I could see the pattern in her messages evolving from disbelief to anxiety to desperation, because every call she made to financial offices or billing departments resulted in automated explanations or requests for additional documentation that she could not provide immediately, and the sense of helplessness began to seep into every interaction she attempted, leaving her both vulnerable and entirely dependent on outcomes she had no control over, which was exactly the point I had been waiting for since the beginning. Her attempts to rationalize and regain control became increasingly frantic and transparent, because she had always believed that charm, aggression, or manipulation could smooth over any problem, and now none of her usual tactics worked, leaving her exposed in a way she had never experienced before. And as she started sending long, rambling messages to relatives and friends that were equal parts explanation and apology, I could see the mounting tension and guilt mixing with anger and panic, which told me she was beginning to understand that the sister she had demeaned for years was not only capable but willing to hold her accountable, and that accountability came without compromise, delay, or partiality, because the responsibility she had shirked was finally being returned to her in full measure. By mid-afternoon, I knew it was time for the most decisive action yet, because every step she had taken to correct one problem was being undermined by another that I had orchestrated, and the culmination of these small, precise manipulations was reaching a point where she could no longer deny the pattern, even if she refused to acknowledge me as its architect, and I decided to freeze access to a portion of the shared account she had assumed was untouchable, creating an immediate financial bottleneck that forced her to make impossible choices between medical obligations, tuition, and everyday expenses. And as I monitored her escalating frustration, I realized the full weight of her dependency had finally come into view, exposing both her vulnerability and the arrogance with which she had treated me for years. Her inbox began to flood with messages that were frantic, contradictory, and revealing, because she attempted to reach every possible avenue for support, ranging from insurance representatives to financial advisors to mutual family members, all while trying to convince herself that this was merely bad luck or a series of coincidences rather than the carefully controlled disruption I had orchestrated. And the cognitive dissonance was starting to take a toll, because she could not reconcile the severity of the problems with her previous assumptions about control, privilege, and my role in her life, which had always been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed entirely. And the longer she struggled without resolution, the more powerless she felt, which was exactly the state I wanted her to experience before the final move. By evening, the messages she sent me became almost incoherent, mixing disbelief, accusation, and entreaty in a way that revealed her mind was teetering between panic and anger. And as I read each one, I understood that the stage was perfectly set for the final revelation, because she had begun to internalize the lesson I had been teaching without ever realizing that I was the instructor, and the balance of power that she had once taken for granted had been entirely reversed, leaving her vulnerable, exposed, and on the verge of a realization that would not only shock her but redefine how she would interact with me from this moment forward. By the time her messages stacked so high that my phone looked like a slot machine that would not stop paying out, I understood that the opening acts had done exactly what they were designed to do, because the bravado had drained out of her tone, and what came through instead was a frantic mix of bargaining, pity, and the kind of anger that belongs to someone who suddenly realizes that the ground she strutted across was held up by a person she had spent years stepping over. And once I recognized that she had reached the place where excuses lose their shine and habits lose their grip, I stopped reading for sport and started preparing the last, clean step that would settle everything without a scene, without a fight, and without any room for the old games to slither back in under a new name. When our mother got sick years ago, the family needed someone to handle the practical things that keep a roof straight when the weather gets mean. And I was the one who learned the portals and the forms and the language of billing offices and bursars and benefits coordinators, which is how my name ended up as the point of contact, the financial guarantor, and the administrator on the very accounts my sister had grown used to treating like bottomless cupboards. And while I did not make a speech about it or demand applause, I did keep meticulous records, because the only way to stay sane around people who rewrite history on the fly is to keep the dates and the receipts and the signatures that do not lie. So on the morning I decided to finish this I opened the folder that held years of careful paper, and I felt a steadiness I had not felt since before she learned that a sharp tongue often gets you more attention than a steady spine. I started with the medical piece because that is where fear grows fastest, and I submitted formal notices, not huffy texts, not family gossip, but actual written revocations of my guarantor status on every account where my signature had kept their balances from touching collections, and I attached the ledger that showed what I had paid, what had been reimbursed, and what had been forgiven under hardship programs I had applied for, and she had taken credit for at holidays, and I requested, in dry and tidy language, that all future communication be directed to her address and her email, because the person receiving the care should also be the person reading the bills, and within an hour the confirmation emails began to land, each one polite, each one final, and each one closing a door that had been propped open by my patience long after it should have been shut. Next came tuition, which is where the entitlement had grown the thickest, and I moved the funding authority a single notch to the right, away from her control and toward direct payment to the schools with stipulations that the student accounts must be kept current by the household responsible for them, because support was never meant to be a blank check with my name on the line. It was meant to be a bridge with rules, and I wrote to the bursars with the same practical tone I had used on the hospitals, clarifying that discretionary support would be considered on a case-by-case basis for the kids themselves if they needed a book credit or a lab fee covered, but that no funds would pass through a parent who had made it very clear, in writing no less, that family was only welcome when invisible, and I cannot describe the relief of watching an old problem reorganize around new boundaries like furniture finally placed where it belongs. Only then did I answer her, and I did it without a flourish, because the outcome needed to be solid and boring so it could not be argued with or performed around. So I wrote one long message that began with her holiday line quoted at the top as a reminder that words carry invoices, and I explained that for years I had handled the ugly work of keeping the lights on and the wheels turning and the bills from breeding, and that as of that morning I was done being the quiet scaffolding for a house that treated me like an eyesore, and I listed the changes in plain English: guarantor role revoked, discretionary distributions suspended, tuition routed directly to institutions with student-level exceptions considered, health reimbursements frozen pending direct communication from providers to her, and then I closed with a single offer she did not expect, which was that if she wanted help again, there would be terms that respected my time and my sanity, including a written acknowledgement of what had been done, a commitment to hold her own accounts like an adult, and a rule that if she could not speak to me with basic decency, she could speak to a billing office without my name on the line. Her reply did not arrive as one message, but as a storm that changed shape every few minutes, an apology that tripped over an accusation, a memory that skipped the parts that mattered, a promise that bent into a threat and then snapped back into begging. And while the part of me that had always folded on the first cry tried to stand up and take over, the new part, the part that had learned that boundaries do not work if they come with a back door, kept my hands still and my mouth shut, and I let the systems do the talking for me, because nothing is more honest than a closed account and a confirmed revocation, and nothing teaches faster than a bill with the right name on it. I did one more thing, a small thing that felt like both mercy and strategy, because I redirected the little cushion I used to slide under her chaos to the people who never asked for it with a sneer, which meant our mother's pharmacy got a standing authorization. Our cousin who actually says thank you got a book stipend paid straight to her campus account, and the kids, who are innocent in this mess, received a note from me explaining that if they ever need something for class they can email me themselves and I will handle it without making their mother a target or a gatekeeper, and that last part might be the real ending, because it builds a path that does not run through the person who turned family into a scoreboard. When the confirmations finished arriving and the noise on my phone slowed to a tired drip, I put the folder back on the shelf and stared at the single line that started all this, the one where she tried to cut me out and still keep the parts of me that made her life easy. And I felt the clean calm that comes when you finally refuse to be both the villain in someone's story and the glue that holds their set together, and while I do not know what she will say at the next holiday or how she will rewrite this to suit her audience, I know that the bills will not come to me, The tuition will not be my problem, the insults will not be free, and the next time she wants the invisible sister, she will get exactly what she asked for. Which is nothing at all unless she learns how to ask like a person who understands what it costs to be kind.